Hi everyone, welcome to the third Drastic Measures live stream. I've got a very special guest with me tonight. He's a science educator, a science journalist, and he's also a parachute enthusiast. This is Mr. SkyDivePhil. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, tonight what we're going to be talking about is essentially an argument against the idea of an all good God. And the basis of this argument is that unnecessary animal suffering is inconsistent with the nature of an all good God. Would you say that's a sort of fair summary of what we're going to talk about
I
tonight,
would
Phil?
say it's an omni god, so it's not just all good. They have to be all powerful and also all knowing. I mean, you could imagine that there's a god that is all good but not all powerful, or one that's all powerful and all good but isn't all knowing. So maybe he doesn't know about the suffering that's happening. So it's generally an omni god, is the way I would phrase it. So that's omnipresent, sorry, omnipotent, omniscient, and so on.
Okay, so all the properties that we would usually associate with typically the Abrahamic God, so the God
Yeah,
that Jewish people, Muslims, and Christians believe in, that kind of classical God. Yeah. Okay. Um.
yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is because I think it's a really terrific argument, and it's one that I think is just not raised enough. With the exception of yourself, you're the only prominent person that I can think of that has raised this on more than one occasion. And I think it's kind of a knockdown argument. Do you want to maybe just give a kind of brief summary of how the argument goes?
Yeah, sure. I would say other people have raised this argument. So I'm not the only one, but thanks for the compliment. So the argument is that there's a lot of problems with trying to make an omni god. So I'm going to define an omni god as one that has three very important properties: all powerful, so omnipotent; all knowing, so omniscient; and omnibenevolent, so all good. So if you have an omni god like that, you have a number of things you have to explain. So one is why has there been hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering that would have happened before any sort of fall event? So if you believe, like particularly Christians do, that suffering came into the world through the fall of man, um, then you've got a big problem. Now the fall event is in the Quran as well, and it's in the Jewish Bible, but I think Christians put more emphasis on that as an explanation for suffering. Um, so the second problem is also that the way we got here. So even if we just forget how long it's been, the sort of engine of our creation seems to be evolution plus catastrophe. So and these are both very violent processes. So evolution is kind of like a form of fascism in a way. You sort of target the weak and kill them off. Um, and of course, there's catastrophe as well. So we didn't just get here. You know, if the impact that wiped the dinosaurs out didn't happen, then there's a pretty seems reasonable to suppose that we wouldn't be here. Um, so that's the second problem. Another problem, if you believe in some of the Bible stories, is that God appears to be quite violent towards animals. So there's the sort of so there's that, and there's also the fact that we are all naturally omnivores, whereas if God had just made us herbivores, that would have prevented enormous amounts of animal suffering. So there's all these problems to be had, and one can ask what's the best way to solve all these problems. And if you just deny that there is such an omni god, you've solved them all. Whereas if you believe in an omni god, then you're going to have a struggle.
Okay. Well, yeah. So the part of the reason I came across this argument recently was that you had a discussion with a well-known Islamic Dawah apologist by the name of Ali Dawah. I think he's going to be familiar to most people who will be watching this stream. And this was a few months ago in Speaker's Corner. Now, when I watched that, I thought, well, one of the interesting things that you brought up as to demonstrate the argument was the idea of animals getting trapped in these predator traps, like
That's right.
tar pits, essentially, the
Yeah.
kind of thing that's going to that an animal gets stuck in and then will kind of suffer. It would seem needlessly.
Yeah.
And now Ali Dawah throughout that conversation didn't seem to give. He didn't seem to address it at all. He kept kind of dodging away from it, which I thought was quite interesting. So I didn't know if maybe you just wanted to give it a quick summary of that as an example,
Yeah.
and also maybe if you've actually come across any kind of decent response, because Ali Dawah didn't give one, so maybe
Right.
you've
Well,
come
yeah.
across one from somebody else.
Yeah. Well, I have debated others. So if people go on my channel, go on the SkyDivePhil. By the way, it's called that because when I set it up, I didn't know what it was going to be. So I didn't know I was going to be making all these science documentaries. Otherwise, I would have called it something completely different. But anyway, yeah, if you go on my channel, go on playlists, and you can look at I think debates or animal videos, and you'll see some of the debates I've done with other people who have probably thought a bit more deeply about the topic than Ali Dawah has. So the argument about the predator trap. So for those that aren't familiar with it, the idea is that an animal walks into a sort of tar pit and they get stuck, they can't move. Now what happens is they're going to die. They're just going to starve to death very slowly. But what happens next is that predators go, an easy meal. I'm going to go and eat that, and then they get stuck, and it goes on and on and on. So at the La Brea, and the reason I think it's good to use this as an example. So there's a philosopher called William Rowe who had a very famous argument about a fawn in a forest, and there's a lightning strike and there's fire and the fawn is burnt to death. But that's hypothetical. I mean, of course, it's reasonable things like this happen. But I like this case because we actually have fossils that show this happened. So it's not hypothetical. In the La Brea tar pits in California, there are the remains of 4,000 dire wolves that died in this way. So it just seems utterly pointless. And a difference between that and the Roe example. So you have to ask the question: animals have instincts to avoid fires. I mean, in the Roe case, of course, the fawn can't get out of the forest, so it gets burnt. But they do have an instinct to avoid fires. Whereas this is an interesting one because animals don't have an instinct to avoid tar pits. So why did God, if our instincts come from God, which a lot of theists say they do, why did God give animals the instinct to avoid a fire but not a tar pit? Seems very strange. I think that needs some explanation. So that's why I think this is a very good example. Now, your other question, remind me, was that what are some of the responses that I've had from other people? Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose because Ali Dawah just avoided this
Yeah.
this example you gave, like the play. I mean, he was determined not to address it.
Okay, so my feeling is that Ali Dawah just didn't know how to address it. He tried, but it's obviously something he wasn't particularly familiar with. So I don't know if he was determined not to, but rather I just think he didn't know how, and so he just said whatever came into his head. He wasn't familiar with the arguments. So there are obviously other responses, and then there's various what are called theodicies. So a theodicy is an explanation of why there's evil in the world, a given God. And so people have tried various theodicies, but I don't think any of them work. So do you want some examples?
Yeah, please, if you can give them,
Okay.
that'd be great.
Oh, right. Okay. So the gnomic regularity defense or theodicy, they're slightly different between a defense and a theodicy. So I think a defense is the idea that this is something that we don't know to be false, or we don't necessarily have any evidence for it, but it could be true. I think that's what theologians call a defense. Whereas a theodicy is this is something I think is true. This is the reason why there's suffering in the world. Yeah. So, but I might use terms interchangeably. But if I do, that's the difference actually that theologians use. But anyway, so the gnomic regularity response is that, well, God wants to. It's a good thing for God to create a world with laws, with regular laws, and so the suffering that occurs is just a consequence of those regular laws, and it's just, well, an unfortunate byproduct, collateral damage, I would say. The problem with that is that God does miracles all the time, if you believe, like most religions. I don't know about all the time, but he certainly does it more frequently than you would expect, given that he just wants to make this regular world. And in particular, there are miracles, particularly in the Bible. So it's less relevant for the Quran. Well, it depends what your view about the nature of the Bible is for Muslims, but there are certainly like take the Exodus, and now they do, you know, as far as I know, Muslims do believe in the Exodus story and believe Moses was a prophet of God. But in the biblical description of the Exodus, God kills all the first plague is killing all the fish. He turns the water into blood and all the fish die. The 10th plague is killing all the firstborn, but it's not just the firstborn humans, it's also the firstborn animals. So if God could do miracles to harm animals, why can't he do miracles to alleviate their suffering? It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So I don't think the nomic regularity argument works. And there are various other ones. I think the only one that would work if true is what's called the Neo-Cartesian defense. So the Neo-Cartesian defense basically says that animals don't really suffer. And if that were true, I think this would diffuse the argument, but it's just not true. So that's my take on that.
Just to address that, the idea that animals don't suffer.
Yeah.
I think I've heard you argue that a couple of times. I think particularly on a radio show with some Christians, or a couple of different Christian pastors. I found that position kind of quite silly. I mean, how have they tried to justify that?
Okay, so just to clarify, obviously I'm not arguing that they don't suffer. I'm arguing against the people that say they don't suffer, and it isn't pastors that I've argued with. It's Christian philosophers. So how have they tried to defend that? I mean, the main attempt to do this it goes back a while. I mean, Descartes had this view that animals were just machines. They're no different to, you kick your dog and it yelps, and it's no different to a clockwork toy making a sound. So that goes back to Descartes, and that view has been around ever since. Now it's called Neo-Cartesian because of that, trying to revive the Descartes view. Now the more modern versions of this are called Neo-Cartesian. Now neo, of course, the word neo means new, right? So we're talking about a new version of the argument. How is it different to the old version? So the new version accepts that animals are sentient and conscious, which Descartes denied. But instead, what they argue is that they don't feel morally relevant pain. And sort of the two people that I've engaged with the most on this issue is Michael Murray and William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig quoted Michael Murray in a debate with Stephen Law. And he said, and his argument was, now Michael Murray wrote a book about this called Nature, Red, and Tooth and Claw, where he tries to provide explanations for why a good God, or an omni God, would allow animal suffering. And the second chapter of the book was about Neo-Cartesianism. So Craig went up in this debate with Stephen Law, and he said, well, animals don't suffer as we do because they don't have a prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is required self-awareness, and without that, the animals aren't self-aware, and so they don't feel morally significant pain. Now, that actually, this is really interesting and not widely realized, but it actually contradicts, even though he was quoting Michael Murray, it actually contradicts Murray. And the reason it contradicts Murray is because Murray was not arguing that animals lack self-awareness. What he made a different argument, and what he said was that in order to feel the unpleasantness of pain, you need the prefrontal cortex. And the evidence he presented for that was that people that had a lobotomy, which is where you sever the the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. They reported that they felt pain, but it no longer bothered them. So it's like they had the sensation, but not the unpleasurable emotion you might attach to it. So this is called pain affect. So that feeling of unpleasantness is called affect, or affect is associated with emotional states. Whereas you might distinguish that between nociception, which is just an automatic reaction. Now, how does this contradict what Craig said? It contradicts what Craig said is because Murray was relying on the reports of people that had lobotomies. But in order for them to report on what their pain states were like, they have to be self-aware, right? So he's literally, Craig and Murray are actually contradicting each other. Or it's really Craig contradicting Murray, because Murray made the claim first and then William Craig quoted it. So now, why do we know this is false? Well, I guess there's lots of reasons, and I put it in a paper. I wrote a paper called what was it called? I think. Well, if you Google neurofunctional resilience, neo-Cartesianism, you'll find it. So it was by myself, Phil Halper, I'm the lead author, and Ken Williford is the chair of the philosophy department at University of Texas Arlington. We have Perry Fuchs, who's a world-leading pain expert, and David Woodralph, who is a brilliant neuroscientist. And he was actually, Ken and David have worked on a new theory of consciousness with Carl Friston, who's the world's highest cited neuroscientist, and in fact, he's one of the most highly cited scientists in the world. Anyway, the paper. I guess there's 2 points that I could mention briefly. One is that if you look at, so the evidence was supposed to be these lobotomy patients. Clearly, if the lobotomy patients are reporting about their pain, they must be self-aware. So that is automatically refuted. But what about the question of their affect, their pain affect? Well, really, what I did was I went and dug up all the old case reports and interviews, and what you find is that the science is being misquoted. So it wasn't the case that these people didn't have any pain affect. What was the case is that a particular type of pain called chronic pain, so that's the sort of pain that lasts a long time, way longer than you would need to sort of avoid a noxious stimuli or protect an insulin or something like that. Their worry about their chronic pain was relieved. But, for example, their acute pain was just as bad, if not worse, as before. So they still felt pain and they still found it bad. So what was, now my sort of hypothesis here is that the reason their worry about their chronic pain was relieved was because one of the things we do know about the prefrontal cortex is involved in what's called executive function, and in particular planning for the future. So what you could imagine is that their worries about the future were relieved. That makes sense. But it still felt pain. So maybe they live more in the present. And so that's what was going on. But it's just not the case that they didn't mind pain. More importantly, after I started criticizing William and Craig for making these claims, there was a paper came out which was absolutely remarkable. And what happened was, and it made all the news, it was in the science news everywhere, it was a really big deal. They found a patient who had no prefrontal cortex, and they tested his self-awareness, and it was perfectly intact. And that shows that the prefrontal cortex is not a necessary condition for self-awareness. So that was stunning. I mean, that was a really big deal. It blows this argument out of the water, at least Craig's version of the argument. Now, but not necessarily Murray's. Because remember, Craig was saying prefrontal cortex needed for self-awareness. But Murray wasn't saying that. So what about pain affect? So what happened then? I actually contacted some of the people that were authors on the paper, and that was actually David and Ken. I think Perry was as well. I sort of, we started talking about these claims, and I was like, you're really refuting these claims. They didn't know about them. but they were very keen to sort of get involved with it. Anyway, around this time, there's another guy called Justin Feinstein, and what he did was he took this patient and tested his pain perception. Now, if Murray is right, then he shouldn't have any pain affect. Remember, affect is the feeling of negativeness, negative emotions associated with pain. Well, that wasn't the case. He was actually what were called hyperpathic to pain, which means much more sensitive to pain than normal. And the way they did that, they don't torture the guy, by the way. What they do is they ask someone to put a hand in an ice cold bucket of water, and then they say, hold it there until you find the pain is intolerable to you. So whenever it's intolerable, you can withdraw it, but you decide when it's tolerable or not. And they measure how long people can keep their hand in the ice cold bucket, and he was way shorter than normal. And in fact, he tried to keep still, and then having scanned the brain to see where the pain was happening. And they couldn't do it because he couldn't keep still, even though he tried. He said, I can't do it. And in an fMRI scan, you need to keep very still. Otherwise, you won't get good data. So they were not able to get good data. But what that shows you is that it can't be the case that the prefrontal cortex is necessary for pain. So they had all these clever arguments. If you just hear them, you start quoting about bits of neuroanatomy, and they sound very sophisticated. But when you look at them in detail, you find that they fail.
Well, this kind of leads in. There was a couple of comments which I have just put up from the chat, which is making reference to Halal Slaughter, which is it's slightly off topic, but it is obviously associated with animal suffering. So I come across a lot of Muslims and also Jewish people with kosher slaughter who will say that it's the most humane method of killing the animal because you cut through the jugular and apparently the nerves around it, and it's like instantly cuts off the pain. Yet I'm sure I've read scientific papers where they've done brain scans of animals that have gone through halal slaughter, and the pain receptors are still firing sometime after the throat has been cut, which suggests that the animal is still feeling pain. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because I find the argument rather crazy. They're trying to say that this is the most humane way. So what would you say in response to that?
I'm not familiar with any brain scans of animals being slaughtered. I think that would be difficult to do for the reasons I said, that you need to keep very still to get good data on a brain scan. But my understanding is that there has been some study of whether halal and kosher slaughter methods are the most humane. And from my recollection, and I can't say I know the literature very well, it is not the most humane. And in fact, the suggestion is that the animal should be stunned before killed, and that is not done in halal and kosher slaughter. But it's not something I know a lot about, because I don't think it's relevant for this argument. The argument is not Jews and Muslims slaughter animals in an inhumane way, and therefore Judaism and Islam are false. We don't use that argument. So the argument is there's been hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering. The engine of our creation is very violent, things like that. So we don't really use the argument of particular slaughter methods. So that's why I'm not particularly familiar with the literature. But from my memory, I would say it's not particularly humane.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. Yeah, as I say, it is a slightly different issue, so that's fair enough. I wanted to bring up something which Ali Dawah came up with in the conversation that you had with him. He adopted what's known as the skeptical theism position, essentially arguing that okay, there's animal suffering, but there may be a good reason for it. We just don't know what that reason is, but we can just sort of assume that God's got a good reason. So what would you say to that as an argument?
Yeah. So what I said in response to Ali was, I think I want to concede the point quickly that it's certainly true that we can imagine that for an apparently bad thing, there could be some good that we are not aware of. So that is conceivable. Does it work here? I think not. So let me try and explain why. If you're going to go down that route, then there's going to be a big cost, which I think is going to unwind your whole case for theism. In particular, whilst logically it's true that an apparent bad could have some hidden good, it's also true that an apparently good thing could have a hidden bad. And if you're going to praise God for anything good that he did, then you should also be able to criticize God for any bad that he did, or or they allowed to happen. So let's take an example. We see a young child, let's say, with leukemia, and we pray and hope they get better. So now they don't get better and they die, right? So that looks bad, right? It looks like unnecessary suffering for the victim and for the victim's family. But you could say, well, you know what? Maybe that child was going to grow up to be the next Hitler. So it was a good thing that they died. You just didn't know that. God knows that in his ultimate wisdom. And so you can't say that it's bad because, maybe there's that great good that you didn't see. And that's logically true. But let's just flip it around. Let's imagine we prayed for the child and they survived. People are going to say, praise to God, praise, right? Well, maybe we could say, well, that child is going to grow up to be the next Hitler, right? So what appeared to be good actually was bad. And then you could say that for literally anything, right? Maybe you might think it was a good thing that God created the world, but maybe he only created the world so that we could all suffer later on, So the problem is you're unwinding like everything that you're going to believe in. For any reason that you think you have to praise God, you now have to question that, right? The other thing is you could also say, well, look, God might have a good reason for suffering that we don't know and he hasn't told us, right? Logically true. But he also might have a good reason to lie to us. So maybe, every time God communicates to humans, he's lying and he's deceiving us. But, he's got a reason to do so that we don't know. And in fact, I like to just have a fun example of what God's intentions might be. So let's imagine that God's given us holy books with bad things and good things in them. But what he wants is for you to condemn the bad things that are in those holy books. It's like a moral test for you. And if you just accept everything in them, he's going to send you to hell, right? So the bit where it says, no, believe the book or whatever, that was the lie. Right. So now, of course, British people aren't going to accept my scenario here. But if you're a skeptical theist, why not? So I think skeptical theism just opens up a can of worms for the theist that is going to undermine the house that they're standing in.
There was another issue that came up in the conversation you had with Ali Dawah. It was not just him actually. There was another guy involved in the conversation who joined in, and they were talking about compensation for suffering. So they're essentially saying, well, doesn't really matter about the suffering too much because they'll get their reward in paradise. Now, I'm not aware of the position of animals going to paradise in Islam or in Christianity, but again, do you want to give your kind of response to that as to where you think that lies as a good or a bad argument?
Right. Okay. So I don't think the response works. And the reason I don't think it works is because God could give them a compensation anyway. Now here we might not use the phrase compensation. In fact, someone picked up on that. The guy picked up on that. But you can't have compensation unless something bad's happened. But he's just mistaken the notion with the language, right? The notion is that there's a compensating, there's a good that you're going to get that compensates for the bad, right? The point is that I would make is that God could give you that good anyway, so the bad is left unexplained. So let's think of it this way, right? Here's our bad thing that's happening, right? So it's this big, and God's going to give you this great big good afterwards, so it compensates. Now, if you think of a normal scenario where you get compensation for something bad, so I think the example I had was imagine a company poisons a river with pollution, and the town suffers, and then the company compensates them all, gives them, maybe each person in the town $1 million or something, right? Now they might feel that they've been compensated. They might even prefer to have gone through that, experienced the bad thing from the pollution, but got the money afterwards. So they might say, net now, I'm better off. But the point is, if I ask them, well, would you sooner have the money and not the pollution? I think they would say yes, right? The reason a company doesn't do that is they think they have limited resources, so they can't just dole out $1 million to everybody. But God doesn't have limited resources. So it's left unexplained then why the bad thing has happened, right? You could have had the goods that are coming to you in heaven without the suffering. And indeed, many sentient beings have less suffering than others. So presumably, everyone could have those goods in the afterlife. So it's unexplained then why some have more suffering than others. Compensation doesn't help. And the other thing to say about compensation is that it doesn't justify the bad thing. Think of it this way. Imagine imagine you're trying to claim the company that compensated the people was all good. Now, that the fact that they compensated people doesn't change the fact that they did something bad. They polluted the river, right? So even if net is good because they've given people a compensation, they still shouldn't have polluted the river. So it doesn't explain the problem at all.
Yeah, I would agree. I would. There's something else related to that, and it goes back to the tar pit example that you gave, because it was brought up in the conversation with Ali Dawah that, or rather he brought it up to try and, I think at one point talk about, well, suffering, it's like life is a test, which is kind of a typical um, Islamic reasoning for why suffering is necessary, and it's um, about, in part, say, character development and building your morality and that kind of thing. And I thought it was a good point that you made in that. Well, how does that work with animals that are stuck in a tar pit? I mean, you could argue on the one hand that it doesn't really work with animals at all. Maybe they don't have the capacity to develop that character in the same way as a human being would morally. I don't know what you think about that, but also it doesn't really give them much chance, does it? As well, at the same time, if you're just stuck there, what do you learn by just starving to death over some number of days or weeks? I mean, how does that give you that capacity to develop your character?
Yeah, this is called this. Well, okay, so two issues here. There's the test thing in Islam, and there's what's called the soul making hypothesis. So the soul making, theodicy is that, you build your character through suffering. So we need suffering. But yeah, I think the topic example, I can't conceive of any way that there's any real character building going on there. So that's why I think this is an interesting example. Now, you've asked the question, are animals capable of that? I mean, it probably varies from animal to animal, but I don't think we know. I'm sure that there are some animals that have greater capacity for change in their behaviours and so on than others. But I just don't think it matters because I just don't see what the opportunities to build your character are when you're stuck in a tar pit, starving to death. Also, I mean, generally we are, and I think it's true to say that we are prepared to deal with some level of discomfort to build our characters. So one of the guys in that chat talked about trying out to be in, I think he said the Royal Marines or something. And people that train, like run marathons or whatever, they are prepared to have some level of discomfort. So that's true, but I think there's usually a limit to it, right? I mean, no one's going to run a marathon if there's a sniper picking people off. There'll be a point where they say that's too much suffering. So I think it's just obviously way too much. Now, but also, here's the other problem with the soul building hypothesis is that, well, God could just give you those qualities anyway, right? I mean, presumably the theists think that God did give us certain qualities. So why didn't he just give us the qualities that we had to get through the soul building? Just give you the courage or whatever it is. Now, so to come on to the it's a test response. So this is, I think, the most common reply I get from Muslims. I never get this from Christians or Jews, but I have heard it a lot from Muslims. So I guess this is a key part of Muslim doctrine from my experience of interacting with Muslims. So the idea is, well, God's giving you a test. Now, there's a couple of replies to that I can think of. So the first is to say, why is God giving you a test? I mean, if you think about why we test people on Earth, so to come back to that example of someone going through selection for some military unit, they will put the candidates through, hell. And we don't necessarily think that the selectors are evil for putting them through this hell of selection. And if you've watched TV shows like SAS, what is it called? Are You Tough Enough or something? There's a Channel 4 program where people go through a sort of, I guess, a watered down version of SAS selection, one friendly for TV. I'm sure the real thing's much harder. But anyway, so there's some differences. So first difference is people have signed up for it. They know what is in for them and they agree to it. That's not the case for living creatures, right? It's not like they were presented with the awful suffering they were going to go through and signed up for it. That's not correct, not in any way analogous. The second thing is, one of the reasons why you are tested, even if it's not a physically strenuous test, it might be like a maths test or something, is because the tester has limited knowledge, right? They don't know whether you can cut it as a member of some elite military unit. They don't know whether your maths is good enough. So they set you a test to see whether you are good enough. But that's not the case for God. God knows the outcome of any test that you're going to have, right? So he doesn't need to put you through the suffering because he already knows what the outcome would be. So he doesn't have the limited knowledge. So that's the second reply to the testing. The third reply is that if we're going to try and assess whether a tester is just, and the claims of the religions we're talking about is that this God is just. In fact, he's omnibenevolent. He's perfectly good. Right. Well, one way, if you want to try and decide that, and this person, this being, is conducting tests of other beings, is the test fair? I mean, let's suppose we had a maths test where we just say, okay, if you pass this test, I'm going to buy you a house, right? Okay, so we give half of the people the question 6 times x equals 12. What's x? Well, that's pretty easy, right? Okay, so now we give the other half some really complicated differential equation to solve. Right? You would say this test is not fair, right? This is unreasonable. The person administrating the test is not being just because they're giving some people an easy test and another a really hard test, and it's not fair. So this seems to be analogous to the suffering argument. There are some beings that go through horrendous suffering and some that don't. So the administrator of the test seems to be unjust. So those are my replies to the test defense. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to read the question out here because of the delay that we're getting with StreamYard. So the question is, does suffering of other species lead to moral lessons for us? Could that be a reason behind it? So I guess, yeah, could be, but let's think about that for a moment. Would it be just for us? So let's just talk about the suffering that we're conceiving here. Think of the dinosaur extinction, right? Like, I don't know what percentage of the animals went extinct, but it was high. A large percentage of all the animals on the earth went extinct. And in fact, there have been other mass extinctions that are worse. The Permian, I think it was more than 90%. Sorry, so can we conceive of a moral lesson that we would get that would justify multiple mass extinctions? I find that hard to conceive. And wouldn't there be another way for God to give us that knowledge without all the suffering of animals? And also, is it surely the if there's going to be some compensating good, what shouldn't it fall on the beings that suffered? Would it be okay for me to make someone else suffer so that I get some benefit, even if it is a moral lesson for me? I don't think so. So that I don't think sort of defense will work here. Okay, so what if there's so the question is, what if there's a hierarchy of suffering? Animal suffering could be seen less important than human suffering. So yeah, it could be. I mean, for me personally, I do find the suffering of humans to be more important than the suffering of other animals. And that's probably because I'm a human. So I also think that the suffering of my loved ones is more important than strangers. For me, obviously, I don't think that in the abstract sense. I mean, I can't justify that rationally. That's just my feeling. So now, even if it's the case that animal suffering is less important than human suffering, it doesn't matter to this argument, because in order for this argument to work, we just have to show that there are some cases of unnecessary suffering. We don't need to show that that suffering is as bad as for humans. Doesn't need to be. It just needs to be unnecessary. And I think it is unnecessary. So if the dire wolves that were starving in the tar pit, if for some reason we consider their suffering not as bad as a human dying in a tar pit, then it doesn't matter. As long as it's bad and unnecessary, then we can run this argument. It doesn't need to be equal levels of sort of pain and suffering for every different type of species. It just has to be a bare minimum. Okay, so would it be possible for an animal to have an instinct to avoid a tar pit? With fire, isn't the heat the thing that makes an animal back? How would that work with a tar pit? Well, I mean, God could just give them the knowledge. I mean, we have the knowledge to avoid dangerous things. So God could just give us that knowledge. Obviously, we are talking about a supernatural being. So presumably a supernatural being who has the ability to make a universe. And don't forget, theists think, and particularly the Muslims I encounter, think that God created each species like one by one. He didn't just set evolution in motion. He created each species as a sort of divine act of his will. So he could have, if he can create them, he can create them with an instinct to avoid a tar pit. So he presumably gave them that instinct to avoid a fire. So he could just give them the knowledge. And in fact, animals do pass knowledge down from one generation to another. Orcas, for example, have been shown to teach tricks to their young that other orcas don't know about. So they can pass knowledge down. So it would be possible. And again, for a supernatural being, presumably anything is possible. So I don't see any reason why a supernatural God could not give animals these instincts. But he did. Do I think the inherent suffering of the evolutionary process itself is enough to make the unnecessary animal suffering argument? Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think it's a powerful part of the argument. If the other parts of the argument that I mentioned, for example, the length of of animal suffering, sorry, were shown to be invalid, then that one would be enough to carry the argument. I think what you'd have to show is that God couldn't have created the world through some other means. So, because the main response to this sort of evolutionary argument is the gnomic regularity reply, that God wants to create a world with physical laws, um, and follows all these regularities, and he couldn't have done it any other way. But as I say, I think that's just contradicted by the fact that God is intervening doing miracles. So, and he does miracles that actually create animal suffering, like the flood, like the 10 plagues. In fact, in the Bible, there's the story of Legion. Sorry, in the New Testament, where Jesus kills 2,000 pigs, drowns them, because there's a demon, and he wants to expel the demon. And rather than just killing the demon, he puts the demon into these 2,000 pigs, and they all drown. So if he can do miracles to hurt animals, why can't he do miracles to help them? So that's my reply to the gnomic regularity response to the evolutionary part of the argument. But I agree, it is the evolutionary part of the argument is sufficient to run the argument, but there are many other ways you can run the argument. Yeah. So the question is, surely we could have a form of evolution with little to no suffering, instant death when animals kill each other. I mean, we my co-author and I, we tried to come up with ideas like, what if animals had like painkillers in their teeth, so that when a predator ate a prey animal, they immediately injected them with something like morphine or something. Now it turns out that I got bitten once by a form of leech, and it sucked my blood, and I didn't feel a thing. And I believe that actually it did do this. I might be wrong about that. So I have to say I don't know a lot about leech anatomy, but I believe that's what happens. So if it can happen in one animal, why can't it just happen in lots of them? Alternatively, why not just have no predation? We could maybe have like get energy from the sun like plants do. Why not? Then we wouldn't have any predation. So why not just not have predation? Or at least if we are going to have predation, it would be really good if humans were not omnivorous or carnivorous, because we're causing like mass extinction of other animals through our actions, and particularly cutting down animal habitats to grow feed for our plants. So if humans were herbivores, that would enormously reduce the amount of animal suffering. It would probably stop a mass extinction event that's happening right now. And so God could have done that. He made some animals herbivores. Why couldn't he have done it to humans? Anything else I want to say on the argument that we have not covered? So I guess if we're reviewing this debate with Ali Dawah, for those that saw it, I mean, he just had lots of red herrings, in my opinion, bringing out topics that just had nothing to do with the argument in hand. And I think this is reflective of the fact that this argument is not well known amongst many Muslim apologists. But yeah, my efforts are to try and make it better known, because I think it's a very strong argument, and we haven't covered the free will defense. I mean, that's one of the main defenses, that free will explains suffering in the world. But I don't think that argument works. I mean, I don't think it works with people, quite frankly, because it assumes that one, free will is just like infinite good, and you can't stop any suffering, because it would be, if it's infinite good, then there's nothing you should do to stop it. But that just doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, if we saw someone, raping someone else, we wouldn't say, well, I would like to stop that, but I can't. But the free will of the rapist is so important that we shouldn't stop it. Of course, we don't think that. We say, no, the free will of the rapist is not that important. It's not as important as the suffering of the victim. So I don't think the free will defense works in humans. It's going to be even harder in animals. I mean, why does free will mean that we should have like a mass extinction event? Like the dinosaurs experience, like many other animals have experienced, because there's been 5 mass extinctions in the past and there's one ongoing now. So I don't think the free will defense is probably one of the most well-known defenses for the problem of suffering, and I do not believe that works. So I guess that's the one thing we haven't talked about. Yeah, he did keep dodging to human suffering to avoid the question of animal suffering. Absolutely, he did. And I think that means he's not familiar with the argument and just sort of fell back to his standard replies, which don't apply here. This is the reason why many atheists are keen on the argument of animal suffering, because it really does diffuse a lot of the responses from theists who are focused on human suffering.
Yeah, Phil, thanks very much. Hopefully you'll hang on just for a minute, just to hear me finish off. Yeah, it's been a great chat. I'm really sorry that the StreamYard has played up tonight, but I really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me on, and I applaud anyone that got through it despite all these audio different bugs that we've been having with StreamYard. So thank you.